Hello and welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was the Be Good Tanyas with the Cuckoo Bird. Now, if you are someone who listens to the show frequently, then you know that in the past I have talked about the relationships between humans and their pets. So, for example, I did a show where I talked about some research looking into whether pets prevent people from leaving dangerous areas. So, for example, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, some people looked back on some data about people who stayed in the city and people who left, and they looked at whether the responses to that catastrophe were associated with whether or not people were pet owners and could take their pets with them whenever they left the city. I've also looked into the fact that sometimes pets and animals in general are used to try to help people overcome physical problems or medical issues or psychological troubles. And we know that there are a lot of significant relationships between humans and animals, and in particular pets, because people do become quite bonded to these animals. They use them to feel good about themselves, to become more active. There are things that happen that they don't even realize, that they just kind of are subtly made happier when they're around animals. Sometimes these things are actually quite good for people who aren't very good at communicating with other people, but instead can kind of communicate with animals or have a relationship with animals that they can't with other people. And there are all sorts of things that we've looked into in the past. But if you have listened to some of those shows, then you might have noticed that mostly I was talking about common and really popular animals, things like cats and dogs, and in some cases I talked about farm animals and things like cows and horses as well. But actually, the fact that I haven't talked about certain other species is a result of the fact that there hasn't been a whole lot of work on those organisms. And one area in particular that's been kind of understudied in the literature is bird ownership and the avian-human bond. And I recently read a paper about this that was pretty interesting because it used a couple of different techniques to think about how humans relate to birds and whether those relationships are healthy for both the humans and the birds, and what implications these things have in terms of just being a pet owner, but also for pet welfare, and just generally thinking about what is the way in which humans interact with animals and with birds in particular, and can we use that in ways like what I just described with kind of medical issues and psychological issues. Is there something that could be used in kind of a therapeutic way with birds as well? So I want to talk today about that paper in more depth and in more detail, to think about what is the study that they performed, how did they do it, what did they find, and what are kind of the broader implications. Why should we care about this research at all? So as I already mentioned, there isn't a whole lot of previous work looking into the relationships between humans and birds. And this is actually kind of unusual because, at least in the West, and in particular in the US where this study was conducted, birds are the third or fourth most common pets, depending on what survey you are using to look at this statistic. And that means that they are actually quite abundant around the country. So within the US, a recent survey found that just under 7 million homes have at least one bird, and if you look at all of the individual birds, it adds up to over 2.5 million. So obviously the human-bird bond is an important one to understand, because this is a significant portion of the pet population, all of these different birds. And it is particularly true because preliminary research suggests that the human-bird bond can be both complex and also very profound. So just because birds aren't necessarily as cuddly or as soft and snuggly, just because they don't interact with us in quite the same ways that cats and dogs do, that doesn't mean that humans don't bond with them just as much, if not even more in certain ways, because as we know, birds are quite intelligent, and sometimes they are more intelligent than some of these other pets. And so there can be quite a significant relationship that emerges between humans and animals, and it's important to understand that because it can have impacts on human behavior and also on the conditions in which the birds find themselves. So, as I'll mention a little bit later, sometimes when people think of birds as their own family members, they might start to, for example, feed them the same food that humans eat. And obviously that's not good, that's not what birds evolved to eat, and it can be quite unhealthy. So these things can have ramifications for the birds themselves, and that's why it's quite important to understand this relationship a little bit better. Now, avian companions come in lots of different forms, and this is kind of different because if you think about dogs or cats, you kind of have a lot of similarities across all dogs. Yes, a Chihuahua is quite different from a Great Dane, but they have lots of other things in common in terms of kind of acting in a doggy sort of way, in terms of eating dog food, that sort of really basic husbandry kind of stuff. But actually, birds have a lot more variation. So we're talking about things like chickens, which of course would be predominantly outside in most situations, out in a coop, running around the yard, to canaries, to things like zebra finches, all the way up to things like parrots, which are much bigger. They often have free roaming possibilities around a home rather than being shut in a cage all the time. Parrots are quite intelligent, often the biggest ones, so things like an African gray, those have the intelligence of a 2 or 3 year old child. So you're basically talking about, not just an animal there, but kind of the cognitive abilities of another human being. And so you have to interact with them in certain ways in order to give them the stimulation that they need. And you have to enrich their environments to a much greater degree. And you don't normally have this kind of variety from one type of pet to another when you're thinking about dogs and cats. And this is quite an important thing to consider. And I mention parrots here because this is the type of animal in particular that this research focused in on. And that's because parrots are really popular. They are quite intelligent, so that does add a whole other dimension to this kind of research. And there's also quite a long history of human-parrot interaction. So I think the author said something like well over 1,000 years humans have been capturing parrots and keeping them in captivity. Now, most parrots that are raised in captivity still have the genetic profiles of their wild ancestors, and this is despite the fact that actually they have been, for the most part, bred in captivity. The ones that we have in our homes now are not ones that have been brought in from the wild. That kind of ended a few generations ago, and with the exception of a few places where there is kind of a black market still going, we tend to have ones predominantly that were bred 2 or 3 or 4 generations at least within a captive situation. But, despite this fact, they do still have all of those wild-type genes, which means that there's quite a lot of behavior, a lot of morphology, a lot of endocrinology, all these sorts of things are still very much like what we would see out in the wild, which can influence their behaviors and their health in ways that maybe aren't necessarily great for people that want to keep these things in captivity. So we know that dogs and cats, they've been around us for thousands and thousands of years. They have kind of adapted in certain ways to the human environment that maybe some of these birds haven't had a chance to do yet. Now, this isn't true for all captive birds. Zebra finches, for example, they have very much already started to adapt, and you can see this quite well in research populations and also within animals in the pet trade. But parrots are not quite in the same category because they had been harvested from the wild for such a long time that they do still retain quite a lot of those wild characteristics. Now, many companion bird owners view their parrots as something that they called FIDs, so feathered kids, and they will admit to this readily. And the fact that there is actually a word for this suggests that obviously it's quite widespread and very common. And this means that the animals are viewed as being members of the family, and the owners, as a result of this, feel these very deep emotional bonds with the pets. And in fact, the author of this study has had quite a long history of pets in her own family, and particularly of parrots and other birds, and she felt that kind of relationship with them, and that is what caused her to be interested in this particular topic. So she wanted to explore these sorts of things in other animals and other pet owners as well. So in particular, she wanted to explore what do these sorts of relationships, these avian-human bonds, what do these mean emotionally, mentally, psychologically, and also in terms of animal welfare for both the humans and the animals involved. So that's just kind of a brief introduction. So let's think a little bit more about the methods of the study. There were 2 main methods. The first was a survey of pet owners, obviously owners that have various types of parrots, and also an ethnographic observation at a veterinary clinic that specializes in avian and exotic medicine, so a place where there are going to be lots of these types of animals coming in. So let's first think about the survey. So the author chose this format because it was an easy way to interview clients at the veterinary clinic and also people a bit further abroad, because she could create the survey and hand it out at the clinic, but then also use the internet to disseminate it a bit more widely. So one of the amazing things I thought was that many of the individuals who visited the clinic had traveled over 100 miles to reach that area, because there are only so many places that specialize in this sort of veterinary care. So she was able to get a sample size from kind of a wide range of places, people from different backgrounds, people from different geographical areas, which is nice because that means that the sample is a bit more varied and doesn't just represent people from a particular city. So the surveys, as I said, were distributed to clients at the clinic, but then they were also posted online at places where a lot of pet owners, and in particular parrot owners and bird owners, would congregate in order to chat about their pets and share stories and share photographs. So she went online and said that she had this survey, and she posted it and posted links to it and said that people should feel free to share the link with anyone that they thought would respond. And so, of course, a lot of people were sharing this with their friends, so she was able to get hundreds of people responding to talk about their experiences as parrot owners. Now, the survey that she used was quite similar to one that she had developed previously when she collected some preliminary data to see whether this was something that she could actually investigate in a larger project. And what's nice about that is she did that work about 10 years ago, so she was able to compare the current responses to ones from quite a long time ago in order to see whether there were kind of some changes over time, whether certain questions that she asked now helped clarify previous questions that maybe were a bit vague or were a little more general and she wanted to get specific. So that allowed her to kind of make a comparative study and drill down into these issues a bit more than before. So what were the different questions that she included? Well, she had 6 that looked at the demography of the bird owner, so things like gender and age, marital status, ethnicity and race, religion, and occupation. Then she had 9 questions that looked into the person's experience as a bird owner. So where did they get the birds? How many years have they owned the birds? Did they own any birds in their childhood? Previous research has shown that people who get pets in their adulthood often have had experience with those sorts of pets in their childhood, so that's why she asked that question. She also inquired as to whether they were members of bird clubs and other sorts of associations like that that have to do with pets. She asked whether these people had publications on bird care, and if so, how many. How many birds do they own, and what species and ownership did they have of other pets in their lives as well. Were these people specializing in birds, or did they have cats, dogs, horses, all sorts of things? Then she asked, kind of the biggest section on the survey, questions related to welfare and husbandry. So there are 21 different questions looking at all the different aspects of how these people take care of their birds and what sort of experiences they've had in caring for birds. So what are the animals' primary diets? Do the animals get fed any treats? What's the frequency of their veterinary care? What is the location of the bird in the home? Is it in the living room? Is it in the bedroom? Does it have a cage wherever it wants to go? Does it just wander through the house at any time? So things like that. She also looked at the number of hours of sleep that the bird gets, whether or not it sleeps in a separate sleep cage or in its main cage. Who is the primary caregiver? Is it that person who's responding, or a spouse or a child? How often is the bird's water changed? Is the owner aware of dangers associated with things like non-stick cookware and other sorts of kind of household items? Is the owner aware that certain things can be quite damaging to the bird? So, for example, smoking, caustic fumes from cleaning liquids, things like that that the bird might be exposed to and then suffer from. Whether the owner has changed his or her diet as a result of owning the bird. What are the wing trimming practices? Has the bird ever flown away? Has a bird ever died in the owner's care? How much time does the bird get to spend out of its cage each day? How much time does the owner spend with the bird each day? What sort of substrate is in the cage? How often is that substrate changed? And finally, how often is the cage cleaned intensively? So as you can imagine, cumulatively, those questions kind of give you an insight into whether this bird is just kind of being kept to put on show, whether it's really being taken care of well. Is it being taken care of to the extent that maybe a child would, so it gets quite a lot of daily interaction and care? Or is it just kind of more like a goldfish type situation where you can leave it for a couple of weeks and then go back to it and change the water, change the gravel, really trying to figure out just how highly pampered are these pets, just how human-like is the care that they're getting. And also thinking about kind of the health issues associated with the animal, that helps to start elucidate whether the human bird bond can have an impact on how well the animal is being taken care of, and are people thinking about the stuff that they're doing and how those activities are going to impact their pets as well. Now, she also asked 10 questions that related to people's attitudes towards parrots. So now she's moving away a little bit from the stuff that kind of subtly gauges people's attitudes towards the birds, and more specifically starts to address, more obviously, how important is your bird to you and how overboard do you go when you're kind of taking care of your animal. And this is kind of an important distinction, because sometimes when people are more aware of exactly why you're asking a question, it might influence how they respond. So when they think it's just straight up animal husbandry questions, they might not realize, that you're analyzing that in a certain way to get different layers of meaning. But when you start asking about whether you're buying a bird a gift for its birthday, for example, obviously they clearly know why you're asking that sort of question. So those questions specifically were things like, what is your annual expenditure on the bird and on bird products? Do you celebrate religious holidays personally, but also do you celebrate holidays with your animal? So things like celebration of the bird's hatch day or adoption day, or when you have a Christmas celebration, for example, do you include your pet in that as well? Do you dress the bird in costumes? Is the bird provided for in the will at the death of the owner? And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about why that's so important. And all of these were, in addition to these, there were also 5 questions that had the Likert scale. So things where you're ranging from I strongly agree to this statement to I strongly disagree. And these were all questions that explored whether the birds were viewed as family members and kind of as having human feelings. So they asked specifically, do you imagine this animal as being, a sibling, a child, a spouse, that sort of thing? Do you see this animal as having sentience, as being a sentient being with thoughts and feelings? Do you think that it uses human language in a meaningful way? Do you think the bird's body language and vocalizations are something that you can understand and interpret and respond to appropriately? And also, do you think that the birds have souls and spirits? So all of these are to get an idea of how very close are the humans and the birds. Do you associate these things with kind of, your own children? Do you treat them like that? Do you treat them like a friend? Are you a bit more arm's length? And how does that impact some of these other things? How well you care for it, for example. Now finally, there was also one open-ended essay where people could respond just however they wanted and not just pick a choice. And the essay topic was, please tell me about your birds. How has keeping birds changed your life? So people could talk about their own anecdotes from their own lives to explain why it was that they felt the way they do about their birds, and why they have the sorts of interactions that they have. So that is the survey section of the experiment, of the study. The other thing that the author did was perform these ethnographic observations. And these lasted for 2.5 weeks in the clinic of a veterinarian that had more than 15 years of avian practice. So clearly this is a real expert in bird biology. And so this woman was trailing this person to really get an idea of, what sorts of issues come up with birds whenever humans own birds and have them in their homes. How are those dealt with? How do people respond to those situations where they're in a veterinary clinic and have to get help for their bird? So the whole point of ethnography is to experience life as the type of person that you're studying. So in this case, really the pet owners rather more than the veterinarian, but also to analyze that experience and then to describe it to others who aren't that type of person, so that they can understand the psyche of the group and the motivations of that group and kind of how they think. So in this case, the author was shadowing the veterinarian and maybe getting a bit of ethnographic observation from the veterinarian, but mostly watching the people who own those birds, interacting with them, watching them interact with their own birds and with the veterinarian to understand what is going on in the mind and in the heart of a bird owner. And then she took those experiences in order to describe them to us, to the reader, as people who aren't necessarily bird owners, in order to better understand how does this fit in with owning other animals, how does it fit in with medical literature, psychological literature, that sort of thing. So she shadowed the veterinarian just like an intern would, but instead of interacting with patients and equipment and kind of doing a hands-on helping the way that an intern might usually do, she just sat in there and observed surgeries, and she observed interactions in the exam rooms, and then after the visits were over, she spoke one-on-one with the pet owners. And over the course of this 2.5 weeks, she observed 24 different clients. 5 of these were males and 19 were females, and a total of 26 different avian species, which is actually pretty amazing, because that suggests that pretty much every person that came in had a different species of bird with them. That's quite a lot of variety of pets. So the demographics in this particular sample were quite similar to those that were found in her previous study, the one that she did about a decade prior. There were more females than males, which suggests that even though this is kind of a smallish sample size, you can kind of trust the idea that maybe birds are more likely to be pets of women rather than pets of men. They tended to be about 41 to 50 years old, so you have a slightly older demographic and not so much kind of younger people owning birds. And also most of these people owned birds for over 5 years or more. So these were people that had had those animals in their homes for quite a long period of time. And that might be because they had this particular pet, and birds tend to be kind of long-lived, parrots in particular, so maybe they just had the same individual for quite a long time. Or maybe these were kind of habitual bird owners, and so they had a succession of birds over time. It's kind of hard to tell from this data set. So the patients in this case were mostly parrots. She did actually look at a couple of non-parrots, a dove and a mallard, which I thought was a really odd choice as pets. Not too many people have pet mallards that they actually would take into a vet. Mostly they're just kind of out in your yard somewhere. But anyway, she mostly focused on the parrots, and this included things like budgerigars, parakeets, cockatiels, macaws, cockatoos, conures. So there are all sorts of different species that fall under the broad umbrella term of parrot. And that pretty much summarizes actually all of the techniques that she used to look at these relationships. And I will stop there and give you a bit of a break, give you some music to help you relax, and we'll come back and look at all the results of what she found. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Beck with Blackbird Chain and Anthony and the Johnsons with Bird Girl. And just before the break, I was talking about the research methods and the background associated with a study looking at the human-avian bond. And now I want to look at the results of what the author found. And just to remind you, or in case you're just joining us, I'll mention that there were 2 main methods used in this study. The first was a survey of pet owners, people who own, in particular, parrots, and also an ethnographic study of people who had brought their parrots in to a veterinarian for various types of care. So the author has asked people to respond to questions and also to write an essay about their experiences owning birds, and she's analyzed that. And then she has also taken her own experiences within the veterinary clinic for 2.5 weeks, watching people interact with their birds and watching the sorts of issues that came up in association with owning a parrot, and then thinking about how all of this fits together to help explain the human-bird bond and what this means for both people and for the birds. So, the first thing that she found, and I should preface that with one more thing, which is to say that she did find several trends across all of the different questions. So I think there were something like 50 different questions used in the survey, and questions that she had in her mind as she was doing the observations. And she did find that there were several trends that kind of emerged across all the different data sets, regardless of what type of owner you were talking about, what type of parrot you were talking about. She did find certain things popping up again and again, and that's what she's highlighted, and now that's what I'm going to talk about here. So the first general category was overall bird ownership and childhood experience. So as I mentioned kind of earlier, I just briefly mentioned that previous studies have suggested that people tend to gravitate towards the type of pets that they had when they were children, whether that's because They own that animal themselves, or maybe a family member did, or a friend did, and they had a positive interaction, or some other positive early life experience. Those early trends seem to kind of drive people to find those animals later on in their own lives. And indeed, she did find here that 47% of the people that she watched and talked to had owned birds as children, and 10% of these had been exposed to other kind of just generally positive human-bird relationships when they were young. So that meant that about 57%, or more than half, had in fact had some sort of a beneficial experience early in life that seems to maybe be associated with the current ownership of the bird. However, one thing that was kind of interesting was that this still meant that about 43% hadn't ever owned birds until they were adults, and somehow, for some reason or another, still became interested in these animals. And it would be kind of a neat thing to do a follow-up and find out, if people didn't have relationships with birds when they were young, what was it that happened in their lives to make them interested in getting a bird later on when they were old enough to do so. So the second kind of broad category that she looked at was affection and physical contact. Now, other researchers have noted that touch is a really important part of human-pet relationships, and also in animal-animal relationships. So if you are a pet owner, then likely you spend quite a lot of time scratching your cat behind the ears, rubbing your dog's belly. If you've got a rabbit, they're nice and fluffy and soft, and so you might kind of hold it and stroke it. Whatever animal you've got, you probably do pet it or have some sort of positive physical contact with it in some way. And this is true even of things like tarantulas, hissing cockroaches, snakes. People who own those do take them out of the tank and hold them, even though they aren't necessarily the snuggliest of animals. And of course we know that in the animal world, if you watch a documentary, for example, about monkeys or about birds, you always see these things snuggling up next to each other. They might kind of groom each other, they might just huddle to stay warm, they might snuggle up together at night in order to be safe, and also again to share their body heat. There are lots of species of animals that will come together at various times in order to interact and maintain physical contact, and use that to kind of create a social atmosphere and maintain social bonds. And so it's going to be quite important for both the pet and for the human to have these sorts of interactions. And one of the things that the author points out is that it's also quite important when you're trying to socialize captive reared animals. And this is particularly true if you need to be able to conduct routine husbandry and veterinary tasks. So if you need to give it medication or clip its nails, or for example, if you're talking about horses, you need to be able to put the horseshoes on it and to clean out the hooves. So all sorts of reasons why you would need to be able to maintain a physical relationship with whatever sort of pet you've got. And during observations at the clinic, the author did notice that lots of people snuggled with their animals in various ways, but that in particular women tended to hold the parrots quite close, and they would snuggle with them, they would put them under their chins, they would kind of nuzzle them, all sorts of kissing, hugging, that sort of thing, even though we don't necessarily think of birds as being the cuddliest of animals. Now, men often held the parrots further away from their bodies, but would also periodically bring them in closer in order to have a bit of a snuggle or a kiss, or kind of rub its head, rub its chin, that sort of thing. And in fact, there was one man there who said that he knew that his bird loved to have its head rubbed, and so he would frequently do that in order to calm it down and make it happy. So even though men weren't necessarily as demonstrative in public, there was evidence that they were aware of their pets' needs and did enjoy interacting with them in that way. Another category that the author looked at was kind of the role that the parrot played within the home and with the owner of the parrot. So was it kind of a family member? Was it a companion? Did it act as a type of therapist? And she did in fact find that the vast majority of bird owners indicated that they felt that the birds were like a family member. Only one person disagreed and just said it was, kind of an object that was there in the home. Many of the owners referred to themselves as being the mommy or daddy of the bird, and they referred to the pets as their children, or in a similar manner to how a parent would refer to a child. And what's kind of interesting, as the author points out, is that birds are kind of perpetually in this childlike phase, whereas if you have a human child, it does eventually grow up. So if you enjoy having that kind of relationship where you are actively caring for something, then having a pet for example, a bird, is quite nice because it allows you to always feel dependent on if that's a feeling that you do in fact enjoy. Now, 20 of the survey respondents indicated that the pets were lifesavers, and that's a direct quote, who had rescued them from depression, rescued them from contemplations of suicide, and had otherwise provided a reason for living. Some of them also indicated that the pets helped them cope with various challenges, so things like living with a chronic disease, things like arthritis, MS, paralysis, that sort of thing. So the birds gave them something to focus on, someone else to care about, something to do, and in that way kind of lightened their mood, made them happier, made them feel like they had a reason to keep living. Some of the pet owners were therapists, and these guys indicated that when the birds were around, whenever they had sessions with their patients, the sessions were actually improved, and patients seemed to be a bit more relaxed and to do a bit better because they had that other thing to focus on. It kind of maybe softened the atmosphere of the room a bit. There was also a university professor who indicated that whenever the students visited his office where he had a bunch of birds, they really liked the presence of the animals and it made them quite happy. And he said that when one parrot died, there were actually students that he'd never met with before who came in to offer their condolences because these birds were so famous and everyone kind of liked the idea that these birds lived on campus, and so they felt moved to come interact with them. So that shows that even when you're not directly relating with these animals and interacting with them, they can still have a big impact on your life and on how you feel about kind of an area in general. Multiple people indicated that birds improve their mood, their health, or their ability to be a good person, and several directly reported the birds as therapeutic, specifically using that word. Now, when pet owners compared the relationships that they had with their birds to the relationships that they had with humans, many of them actually reported that the bird-human bond was superior, and in fact, a couple of them said that they actually love their birds more than they love their own children, which is pretty intense. Now, some of the reasons for these patterns may include the fact that parrots have, as I said earlier, quite advanced cognition, so they in fact can be like 2 or 3-year-old children, maybe even more. I mean, some of the largest ones, for example, the African gray, they're highly intelligent. They can do very complex tasks. They can use language to a certain extent, so you could have, real relationships with these animals. Some of them, as I mentioned, the fact that they can mimic human speech, they can memorize words and use them appropriately, so that obviously would change the quality and type of interaction. And also many of them have very long lifespans. Now, this is something I kind of alluded to earlier, and I said I'd get to it later. So this is why I was asking about, this is why the author was asking about whether or not the parrots had been included in the owner's wills. So depending on the species, some parrots can live 30 or 40, even up to 80 years in captivity. And unless you get a parrot when you're very young, if it lives for 80 years, it's quite possible that it could outlive you. So if you don't get it until you're 30 or 40, there's a very good chance that you would die before the parrot does. And so people have become increasingly aware of the fact that it's really important to provide for these animals in your will, either to leave money or to designate a place where they'll go, to find someone who will adopt them, to make some sort of provision so that you don't just leave your descendants trying to figure out what to do with this expensive, intelligent, attached animal that suddenly needs a home, because it is like suddenly orphaning a child. So this is why the author was curious about whether people had considered this contingency, and what she found was that about 60% of survey respondents had, which is not too bad. Obviously, it would be better if it were closer to 100, but this shows that over half of people were beginning to think about these issues and had either specified specifically in their will or had asked someone close to them to take care of it and had come to some sort of an informal agreement. Now, the next general category that she discusses in the paper is infantilization, anthropomorphism, and how this has kind of an impact on the general human-avian bond. So this is maybe starting to go down kind of the darker side of the street here, thinking about where the human-avian bond can maybe go a bit wrong, because infantilization is not always healthy if you're treating an animal in ways that you really shouldn't, because it is an animal and not actually a small child. And likewise, anthropomorphism, if you're treating a bird like a human, that's not always good if you're doing to it things that are unhealthy or inappropriate. So the example of the food that I mentioned earlier. And indeed, sharing of human foods was something that the author noticed quite often. So some of these things can be toxic, some of them are just bad for the birds, and over half of the respondents in the author's previous study did admit to giving the birds human things at one point or another. So maybe a piece of a hot dog or a piece of a crisp or something like that that really is not very good for a bird. However, there were people in the current study that said that they in fact ate healthier because they had started purchasing organic produce for their birds in order to make sure that the birds were eating the right food. And then because it was easier to just get the same thing for everyone in the house, they were eating the same way. So this is maybe showing some improvement. People are more aware of what's best for their birds, and so now maybe these husbandry practices are changing a bit. 80% of bird owners agree that birds have souls and are going to experience an afterlife. And what's kind of interesting here is that this includes many of the Catholic bird owners whose beliefs about this actually specifically contradict those of the church. So the Catholic Church says the animals don't go to heaven, but these people decided to kind of overlook that statement of the church and instead supplement or insert their own belief, which is that the parrots do have souls, they will go to heaven, and they will get to reunite with their animals after they die as well. Now, 63% of people celebrate holidays with their pets at least some of the time. 76% of owners felt that their birds could use human language in a meaningful way, which is not surprising because in some cases many parrots in fact can. 99% of people agree that birds are sentient and aware beings with thoughts and feelings of their own. So all these numbers are beginning to show you just how very much people are kind of anthropomorphizing these animals. Now, all of this research all these results, are in line with research that emphasizes that birds are much more intelligent than we previously thought, and so we can have much richer relationships with them than maybe a lot of people would have suspected. In fact, they're as smart as many mammals, including many non-human primates. Another 98% of owners agree that in addition to potentially thinking that these animals can use human language, they also felt that they, the pet owners, could interpret their birds' body language and kind of natural signaling and cueing techniques. So not only do they feel that the birds can use language to interact with them, but the humans also feel that they can use their powers of perception to figure out what it is the birds are communicating in their own kind of natural language as well. And if these people are correct, it's a really nice thing because it hopefully could help improve human-bird relationships by allowing the humans to better connect with the birds in a more appropriate way and potentially not anthropomorphize them too much. So instead of saying, I think the bird, he's been lonely while I've been on holiday and now he's angry, to actually look at the body language and say, actually, I don't think that is an angry bird, that's maybe a bird that's ill, or that's a bird that just is uncomfortable in his cage and needs to be let out. So to maybe have a more realistic and more specific interpretation of the bird's condition would be much better than to just supplement some sort of a human kind of logic instead. Now, the truly dark side is when the human bond kind of fails, and when parrots are seen as objects rather than as, a real living animal that needs to be taken care of. And there were a few kind of indications that this sort of thing could happen sometimes. Now, taking a step back and thinking about why do people have parrots at all is kind of interesting here, because parrots have typically been used by well-traveled, successful, rich people to show that they have this kind of exotic lifestyle that involves lots of money. And in some cases, there are people actually who prefer to just have a taxidermied parrot rather than a living one. And so there are some horror stories of pet stores that were being put in the position of being asked to sell a bird simply so it could be killed and stuffed. And other places where they're breeding up animals that are never going to get any sort of interactions, but instead they're going to be adopted by people who simply want to just stick them in a cage, have them on show, and never really relate to them as a living being. And of course that's very unhealthy because these are very intelligent animals. They have really strong bonds, they have emotions as well. They can be quite upset when conditions aren't to their liking, when they are left alone, when they're isolated. So this is a really important thing to be aware of. And There was one client, for example, who reported that she adopted her bird because she wanted to remove it from an animal rescue area, where these people had a really noble cause in mind. They wanted to keep the animal from being tortured in its original home, but where they were keeping it, they were smoking, and so it was being exposed to smoke, and actually parrots are very susceptible to that, and it can be toxic to them and kill them. So there were reports of situations where there were some people who maybe they themselves weren't having an inappropriate relationship with parrots, but there were examples that they were aware of where these birds weren't being taken care of quite the way that they should. And so the author does admit that there are situations in which the parrots and the humans weren't necessarily relating to each other as well as they should or could. And it's important to be aware of how those situations can come into being and how we can kind of address those. So at the end of looking at all of these different patterns and reading all the essays and doing all of the observations, what does the author think? Well, she's quite interested in thinking very generally about why humans affiliate with other species just at all. So rather than kind of answer questions, she then poses a lot more questions. So are we using animals as substitutes for humans when they can't really sustain normal relationships with other humans? And this is a theory that's called the deficiency argument. Basically, that people are just, they're unable to interact with people, and so they get an animal instead. And she looks at this question and says she doesn't really think that the answer is yes here. This is not the situation that's being described by her data. So the next question is, do the humans seem to have an innate drive to just simply associate with any living thing at all? And this is called the biophilia hypothesis, and she doesn't feel that this is supported by her results either. The next question is whether humans keep animals because they feel a need to just dominate a thing. And this is, as you might guess, called the dominance argument, which suggests that humans could keep pets but never really truly share an affection with them. And that clearly is not shown here because there was quite a lot of affection. So the final question that she looks at, and this is called the social support model, is whether humans keep pets because the relationships benefit them in both a mental and a physical way. And overwhelmingly, this is what the author feels her survey and observation results support, that rather than being surrogates for humans, pets are adding something to the owner's lives that other humans can't. So they're complementing and they're augmenting human-human interactions and adding new and unique dimensions to the social life. So this is kind of a nice spin on why humans have pets in a modern era. Now, obviously this may not always be the case. This may not be why humans historically owned parrots or any pets, but in this situation, this is what she feels explains the current ownership of these animals. So overall, she feels that the nature of the human-avian or human-parrot bond appears to be quite profound, and that's a direct quote. And for many people, it's obviously stronger than that between humans and cats or humans and dogs. But parrots are quite challenging animals because they do have lots of special needs. They have a special diet. They have psychological needs because they are so intelligent and they do have such strong pair bonds and family bonds. They have social needs and they have those long lifespans. So we need to really be aware of all of the special things that we have to keep in mind as we're taking care of these animals and considering whether or not we actually want to bring them into our homes. And in particular, it's important to avoid infantilizing parrots or misinterpreting their behavior by kind of thinking of them as humans. It's also important to recognize the fact that these birds have advanced cognition. They have a lot of complex things going on in their mind. So we need to give them an enriched environment, space to do things, time to do things, time to interact with us, so they feel fulfilled, so they don't feel bored, so they don't kind of start getting a bit weird. And we know from previous topics on the show that animals in captivity can start to get a little weird. I've talked about this in zoos. And this can happen when you're talking about pets as well. So you want to try to avoid that, especially with an animal that's intelligent like a parrot. And finally, the author suggests that given the general lack of research on the human-avian bond, it would be quite interesting to further investigate what she refers to as the benefits and liabilities of pet bird ownership. So where exactly do these kind of relationships go right? Where exactly do they go wrong? And maybe you could look into other species beyond just parrots and look at things like the canaries and the finches that I mentioned earlier, things that you have out in the yard like ducks and geese and swans. Maybe even think about some of the ones that you have in husbandry situations on a larger scale, so turkeys and ostriches and things like that, because even though those are held for a different reason, you can start to have relationships with these things and certainly interactions between humans and these species. And it's all interesting to kind of create a continuum to understand. Maybe at one end you've got a parrot and another end you've got a turkey, to just kind of understand what are all the different types of human-bird relationships that you can have when you pull these animals into a domestic situation. So that is it for me today. Hopefully you feel enlightened about the human-avian bond. And I will, of course, as always, put all of this up on the Wildside website, although I admit I am a bit behind. And if you have a bird, or if you have had a bird in the past and want to provide some comments about what you thought it was like and how you kind of felt in that relationship, then I would love to hear from you so I could put those up on the Wildside website. So you can always drop me a line through the Facebook page or through my Twitter feed or the Source Twitter feed, and we can get those posted online if you're interested. So I will play you a little bit of a song before I take off, and I think I will choose Bye Bye Bird, how very appropriate, by Lubos Bena and Matej Pasek. So I hope you enjoy the show, and I will talk to you next week.